The women of Caldwell, Kansas, had many things to say about Nora Callahan, and none of them were particularly kind, though most of them were undeniably true. It was the summer of 1879, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man leaning too far over a cliff, half wild and half respectable, never quite deciding which direction it wanted to fall. The cattle drive still thundered through with enough dust to choke a horse, and the saloons did a brisk trade every evening, while the church ladies pursed their lips and made their quiet, determined rounds. It was a town that knew its own business and everyone else's, and the business of Nora Callahan had been a subject of lively debate for the better part of 3 years. She was 26, which some of the matrons considered already dangerously close to the edge of marriageable age. She had copper-red hair that she wore in a loose braid down her back rather than pinned properly under a bonnet, and her eyes were a shade of green so direct and unwavering that men often found themselves looking slightly to the left of her face rather than meeting her gaze head-on. She ran her late father's general store on the main street of Caldwell, and she ran it with an efficiency and a sharpness that left her suppliers nervously double-checking their invoices, and her customers quietly grateful that they never had to worry about being cheated. She had been engaged once, to a man named Harold Prout, who had come courting with sugar candy and compliments, and who had lasted exactly 4 months before announcing that he needed a wife who was a little more pliable in her thinking. Nora had handed him his hat and his candy back with a smile so level and composed that it had disturbed him more than any outburst might have. Harold Prout had relocated to Wichita shortly thereafter, and word had drifted back that he'd found himself a quiet girl who agreed with everything he said and seemed somewhat terrified of him. Nora had wished him luck with no particular warmth. After Harold, the town had collectively decided that Nora Callahan was simply too stubborn to love. Not mean, they were careful to say, because she was fair with her prices and she kept a jar of penny candy for the children, and she had nursed old Widow Perkins through a fever the winter before last without being asked. But stubborn, they said, as though stubbornness were a coat she wore too heavy for the season, too set in her ways, too unwilling to soften. Too much of a woman who already knew her own mind to leave room for a man's. Nora was aware of what they said. She had heard enough whispered conversations go suddenly quiet when she entered the church, enough pointed silences at the quilting circle to understand the town's general opinion of her prospects. She found she could not bring herself to care about it in any meaningful way, which was, she privately acknowledged, probably further evidence of the stubbornness they kept talking about. She had a store to run and books to balance, and a roof with a leak above the storeroom that she had been meaning to fix for 6 weeks. She had more pressing concerns than who thought she should be more pliable. It was on a Tuesday in early June, when the heat was already promising to be merciless, and the trail dust was hanging in the air like curtain fabric, that Callum Reed rode into Caldwell. He came in on a dun-colored horse named Biscuit, which was perhaps the least intimidating name for a horse that anyone in Caldwell had ever heard, and the men outside the livery took immediate notice of this discrepancy, because the horse itself was a fine, well-muscled animal, and the man in the saddle looked like someone who had spent a great deal of time in places that required a man to be harder than he might naturally want to be. He was 31 years old, though he carried it in a way that suggested he'd done more living in those years than some men managed in 50. He was lean in the manner of a man who worked hard and ate when work allowed it, with dark brown hair that sat a little long under his hat, and eyes that were a warm, steady shade of brown that reminded several of the women who later described him of good tobacco or autumn earth, depending on which woman was doing the describing. He had a jaw that held a few days of beard and hands that were calloused and capable, and he wore his clothes with the ease of someone who had no particular interest in impressing anyone, but wanted everything to function properly. He'd come from Texas, trailing a small herd of horses that he was selling to ranchers up through Kansas, which was an honest and moderately profitable way to spend the summer. He had a partner named Ezra Webb who was 52 years old, bow-legged, and deeply committed to his opinions about the correct way to cook beans over an open fire, and the two of them had been riding together for 4 years in the comfortable, easy manner of men who had long ago decided they trusted each other. Ezra Webb had a wife in Abilene whom he visited 3 times a year, and who was, by all accounts, deeply fond of him despite his opinions about beans, and who sent him off each time with enough food packed in his saddlebag to feed him for 2 weeks, and with strict instructions to stay out of trouble. Callum Reed had no one in particular waiting for him anywhere, a fact that had stopped bothering him somewhere around the time he turned 28, or so he told himself on the nights when he was not entirely sure it was true. The first thing Callum did when he got to Caldwell was see to Biscuit, because a man who lets his horse go wanting is not a man worth taking seriously. The second thing he did was go to the general store to replenish their supplies, because they were low on coffee, and Ezra's mood without coffee was a thing that Callum had only once witnessed in its full unpleasantness, and had no desire to witness again. He pushed open the door of Callahan's general store and stepped out of the June heat into the slightly cooler interior, and he took in the automatic way of a man accustomed to reading situations quickly, the clean and organized shelves, the smell of dried herbs and sawdust and coffee beans, and the woman standing behind the counter with her copper braid over one shoulder and her green eyes already measuring him with the calm efficiency of someone who was deciding what category to put him in. "Help you?" she said, and the words were not unfriendly, but they were businesslike in a way that made it clear she wasn't particularly interested in small talk. "Coffee beans if you have them," Callum said, 2 pounds, and salt pork, dried beans, flour if it's not been sitting too long. Nora Callahan looked at him for one more measured moment and then moved from behind the counter with an efficient economy of movement that suggested she knew exactly where everything was without needing to think about it. "The flour came in last week," she said, pulling a sack from beneath the counter. "The coffee beans are fresh. Salt pork is in the back." "Much obliged," Callum said, and then, because he'd noticed the storeroom door behind her was propped open with a bucket, and there was a pan on the floor of the storeroom positioned with the deliberate placement of something catching drips, he said, "You've got a roof leak." Nora turned from the shelf she'd been reaching toward and looked at him with an expression that was, he thought, very carefully neutral. "I'm aware," she said. "Seems like it's been going a while," Callum said, not as criticism, just as observation, gesturing at the pan that was sitting in the center of a faint water stain on the floorboards. "6 weeks," Nora said, and there was something in the way she said it that made him think she was less comfortable with it than she was letting on. "I've been meaning to get it looked at." "I could fix it," Callum said. Nora set the coffee beans on the counter and looked at him again with that measuring gaze, and Callum had the distinct impression that she was running a very quick and thorough assessment of whether he was the kind of man who actually knew how to fix a roof, or the kind of man who said he could fix a roof, and then made it worse. He found himself curious which conclusion she would come to. "Why?" she said. It was a reasonable question, and he appreciated that she'd asked it directly rather than simpering about it or pretending it wasn't strange for a stranger to offer. "Because I've got a few days here while I find buyers for my horses," Callum said, "and I spent 3 winters working for a builder in San Antonio, and I know how to fix a roof, and it seems like a waste to let it sit when I've got the time." "What do you want for it?" Nora said. "Meals," Callum said. 3 days of dinners if it takes that long. I'll bring the materials." Nora considered this for a long moment, and Callum waited with the patience of someone who had spent a lot of time waiting for animals and whether to decide things on their own schedule. Finally she nodded. "Deal," she said, and she held out her hand and he shook it, and her grip was firm and direct, which he found he liked considerably. He paid for his supplies and carried them out, and Nora watched the door close behind him, and then stood for a moment in the quiet of her store, and thought that he had a remarkably calm quality about him, like a man who had nothing to prove and therefore wasn't trying to prove anything. She also thought, with the crisp practicality that she applied to most things, that the roof genuinely needed fixing, and this was a sensible arrangement, and she was not going to attach any significance to the fact that she'd noticed the color of his eyes. Caldwell noticed, of course, because Caldwell noticed everything. By that evening, it was being murmured in the saloon and across 3 different dinner tables that Nora Callahan had hired herself a drifter cowboy to fix her roof, and he'd been in the store for a good 20 minutes, and she'd shaken his hand at the end of it, which was either very practical or very interesting depending on who was doing the talking. Ezra Webb, when Callum returned to their camp at the edge of town with the supplies and the news that they'd be staying in Caldwell for a few days while Callum fixed a roof, raised an eyebrow that communicated a complete and sophisticated conversation. "Whose roof?" Ezra said. "Lady who runs the general store," Callum said. Ezra's eyebrow made a subtle adjustment upward. "What's she like?" "Practical," Callum said, which was the thing he'd noticed first and the thing that had stuck. "Runs a tight store. Has green eyes." Ezra Webb stirred his beans in silence for a moment. "You noticed her eye color," he said. "It's not a crime, Ezra. Didn't say it was." Ezra Webb allowed himself a small, private smile that he turned away from Callum before Callum could object to it. Callum was up on Nora's roof the next morning by 7:30, which she found when she came down from the rooms above the store to open up, and discovered him already on the ladder she'd leaned against the back wall, inspecting the shingles with a thoughtful frown and a hammer looped at his belt. He had a cloth-wrapped bundle of replacement shingles balanced nearby, materials he'd sourced from the lumber yard at the north end of town, and he was doing the thing she found over the course of that first morning that he did with most things, which was to look at the situation quietly and completely before he started doing anything about it. She brought him coffee without being asked at 9 o'clock, and he climbed down the ladder to take it, and he stood in the alley behind her store in the early morning light and drank it with his hat pushed back on his head and said, "3 shingles need replacing, and there's a seam that's pulled apart about 2 feet long. I'll have it done today if the weather holds." "Good," Nora said, and took her own coffee back inside, and that was that. Except it wasn't quite, because at noon she brought out lunch without being asked, and he came down the ladder again and sat on the back step of her store in the heat of the midday sun and ate cold biscuits and sliced ham and didn't say much, but said what he did say with a directness and an absence of performance that Nora found, somewhat against her will, extremely refreshing. He asked her how long she'd run the store, and she told him 4 years since her father's heart had given out, and he said he was sorry, and she said thank you, and neither of them made it more elaborate than that, which was exactly the right amount of elaboration for both of them. He told her he was from a small town in West Texas that she'd probably never heard of, and she said, "Try me," and he named it, and she shook her head, and they both agreed that the West Texas towns had a habit of being extremely certain of their own importance despite their small populations. And it was the first time she laughed in the conversation, and it was a real laugh, not the polite kind, and Callum noted this with more pleasure than was strictly appropriate. The roof was done by late afternoon, and he came in through the back of the store to tell her, and she went up to check because she was Nora Callahan, and she was not going to simply take someone's word for it. She climbed up onto the roof with a sure-footedness that suggested she'd been up here before, and she looked at his work, and the shingles were even and properly sealed and the seam was neatly repaired, and she came back down and said, "Good work." In the same tone she might say, "Correct invoice." Callum Reed found this the most satisfying compliment he'd received in a considerable length of time. He came for dinner that evening as per their arrangement, and she cooked with the same efficient directness she seemed to apply to everything, and they ate at the small table in the kitchen above the store, and the conversation moved from the horses he was selling to the economics of Trailtown commerce, to the difficulties of getting consistent supply deliveries in a town that sat on the edge of the frontier. And Callum thought he could not remember the last time he'd had a meal where the person across from him was so genuinely interesting to listen to. Nora thought, washing up after he'd gone, that she had not once in the evening felt the particular exhaustion that conversations with most people produced in her, the sense of having to keep her edges sanded down and her opinions palatable. She had not kept anything sanded down, and it had been fine, more than fine. She did not dwell on this. She had stocked to inventory. The next 2 days brought a minor complication in the form of Callum's horse dealings, specifically the business of finding buyers for the 12 horses he and Ezra had trailed up from Texas. And the main buyer he'd arranged to meet in Caldwell turned out to be a man named Tom Garrett, who was, everyone in town could have told him if he'd asked, the kind of man who made very confident agreements that he then renegotiated at the last possible moment from a position of inconvenience. Callum sat across from Tom Garrett in the hotel lobby and listened to Tom Garrett explain, with the smooth, rehearsed ease of a man who'd had this particular conversation many times, that the price they'd agreed upon in correspondence was actually somewhat higher than the current market would support, and perhaps they could revisit. Callum looked at Tom Garrett for a long, patient moment. "The price in the letter is the price," Callum said, "and I have the letter." Tom Garrett shifted in his chair and tried a different approach, involving a lot of language about partnership and goodwill, and the importance of flexible business relationships. "The price in the letter is the price," Callum said again, with exactly the same measured tone, and Tom Garrett looked at him and apparently decided that this was not a man who was going to become more flexible with continued pressure, and conceded. Nora heard about this from George Henley, who ran the hotel and was standing near the window during the conversation, and she filed it away without particularly meaning to, as evidence of something she was already beginning to sense about Callum Reed. He came for dinner again that evening, and she'd made pork roast because she had the bones going all afternoon, and there was something slightly celebratory about a pork roast that seemed fitting for a man who just sold his horses at a fair price. And when Callum sat down at her table, he looked at the food, and then at her with an expression that was quiet and warm and a little surprised, as though he hadn't expected to be fed something this good. "You didn't have to do the roast," he said. "It was no trouble," Nora said, which was slightly less than true, but she found she didn't mind. "Heard you've got the Garrett supply contract coming up for renewal," Callum said, after they'd been eating for a few minutes. Tom Garrett was also, it seemed, the largest general goods wholesaler serving the Caldwell area stores, and the contract Nora's father had negotiated was up at the end of the summer. "Yes," Nora said, and her jaw set in a way that Callum was already learning meant she was navigating something she found genuinely problematic. "He give you trouble?" Callum asked. "Gives all the women business owners in this county trouble," Nora said, with a directness that conveyed the full extent of what she meant without elaborating into territory she'd long since grown tired of explaining. "He's been trying to get me to take a partner since my father died. By partner he means husband. By husband he means someone he can deal with directly rather than through me." Callum was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "That's a poor way to run a supply business," he said finally. "It's a poor way to run anything," Nora said. "You got other options for the contract." "I've been writing to a supplier out of Wichita," Nora said. "The terms are slightly worse, but the dealing is straightforward. I'm leaning toward that." Callum nodded, and she appreciated that he did not tell her what to do or offer an opinion she hadn't asked for. He simply received the information and acknowledged that she'd already thought it through. "The Wichita supplier sounds like the better choice," he said, which was an agreement, not a direction, and the distinction mattered to her. It was the 4th evening, the one beyond the original 3 of their agreement, when Callum arrived at the kitchen door with his hat in his hand and a slightly uncertain quality about him that she had not seen before and found oddly endearing, and said he knew the dinner arrangement was finished, but he'd gotten some venison from a hunter at the edge of town, and he thought, if she didn't mind, he'd be glad to cook dinner for her for a change. Nora stood at the door and looked at him and felt something shift very slightly in her chest, like a board settling, and said, "I don't mind at all." He was a good cook, and this surprised her and also did not surprise her, because he was the sort of man who seemed to be quietly competent at whatever he turned his hands to. He cooked the venison with dried herbs from his own supply and potatoes from her larder, and he moved around her small kitchen without awkwardness, finding what he needed without making a fuss about it. And she sat at the table and watched him and felt the strange and unfamiliar sensation of someone taking care of something without her having asked them to. They talked through dinner and into the evening, and somewhere in the telling of a story about a cattle drive he'd ridden 4 years previous, where a flash flood had come down a canyon at 3 in the morning, and the whole situation had been resolved through a combination of good horses and extremely bad language. Nora laughed until her eyes watered, and Callum looked across the table at her with an expression that was open and unguarded and completely unself-conscious. And something passed between them in that moment that was warm and real and not at all accidental. "Can I ask you something?" Nora said when the laughter had settled. "Go ahead," Callum said. "Why are you still here?" She said, "You sold your horses. Your business in Caldwell is done. Ezra is waiting." Callum looked at her for a long, steady moment, and she looked back without flinching, and he thought that this was a woman who would not let you be anything less than honest with her, which was, he realized, not a burden but a relief. "Because I'd like to keep talking to you," Callum said simply and without decoration. Nora was quiet, holding his gaze. "That's an honest answer," she said. "Seemed like the right kind," he said. The next morning brought the first real complication, which arrived in the form of Millicent Graves, who was the wife of the town's most prominent lawyer, and was also the self-appointed social weather vane of Caldwell. Millicent Graves came into the store at 10 in the morning when there were 2 other customers present, which Nora suspected was not a coincidence, and leaned on the counter with the expression of someone delivering news for the recipient's own good. "I just think you should know," Millicent Graves said, in the particular tone of a woman who very much wants to say a thing but wants to be seen as reluctant about saying it, "that people are talking about this cowboy spending his evenings at your place, Nora. People are concerned." Nora was counting bolts of calico fabric at the far end of the counter. She did not stop counting. "Which people?" she said. "Well, various people," Millicent said, with a gesture that encompassed the general citizenry. "This man is a stranger, he's a drifter. He has no roots here, no property, no standing. He fixed my roof," Nora said, making a note in her ledger, "and he's been to dinner, which I believe is legal in the state of Kansas. Don't be difficult, Nora." "I'm not being difficult," Nora said, setting down her pencil and looking at Millicent Graves with her direct green gaze. "I'm running my store and minding my business, which is what I do most days. I gently suggest it might be a productive use of Caldwell's concern if it were directed at something that actually needed it." Millicent Graves left with the expression of someone who had tried to help and been refused, and the 2 other customers in the store both found reasons to examine the goods on the far shelves with great attention, and Nora went back to counting calico fabric. When she told Callum that evening, sitting on the back step of the store in the warm June darkness where the stars were enormous and the sounds of the saloon carried faintly from the main street, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Does it bother you, what they say?" "It used to bother me more," Nora said honestly. "Now it mostly just tires me." "What changed?" "I stopped waiting for their approval to run my life," she said. "It was taking too long." Callum smiled, and in the light coming from the kitchen window above them she could see it clearly, a real and unguarded smile. "That's a good policy," he said. "What about you?" she said. "You're a man who doesn't seem particularly bothered by anyone's opinion of your choices." "I try not to make choices that require a lot of defending," Callum said. "Work hard, deal straight, be kind where you can. Most of the rest of it tends to sort itself." "Most of it," Nora said. "Most," Callum agreed, and they both let that sit there comfortably, the way that honest people could let an honest caveat sit without needing to explain it further. Ezra Webb, who had been a patient and philosophical presence on the edge of all this, appeared at the store the following morning, and Nora met him for the first time, and he shook her hand with the careful formality of a man who had been coached by his wife to be respectful and had taken the coaching seriously. "Ma'am," Ezra said, "I've heard considerable things about your store." "All of them true, I hope," Nora said. "Only the good ones," Ezra said, with a dignity that made it clear this was a compliment, and Nora liked him immediately. Ezra bought coffee and salt and a length of rope, and then paused at the door and said, with the slightly elaborate casualness of a man making a very deliberate point, "That Callum Reed is the finest man I've known in 20 years of working the trail, in case that's of any particular use to anyone." Nora looked at him over the counter with her level gaze. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. Ezra nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had said what they came to say and turned to leave, and then turned back once more. "He told me this morning that he was thinking he might stay in Caldwell a little longer," Ezra said. "Just so you know, thought about it himself, wasn't asked." Nora was quiet for a moment after the door closed, then she went back to her inventory, but she was smiling as she did it. Callum stayed. He found work easily because men who could work hard and honestly were always needed in a trail town, and within a week, he was helping at the livery stable during the morning hours and spending afternoons doing various repair and labor work around town that people needed doing, and he was consistent and capable and did not make noise about himself. And the men of Caldwell decided, with the slow, pragmatic certainty of a community that valued usefulness over spectacle, that he was all right. The women of Caldwell were somewhat more divided, which is to say that the older married ones were quietly thrilled that something potentially romantic was happening to Nora, and at the same time slightly scandalized that it was happening in such an unstructured way, without formal calling hours or the appropriate intermediary conversations with the church minister. The younger ones were simply envious in the straightforward way of young women in a frontier town where interesting men were in shorter supply than boots or sugar. And Nora and Callum moved through those weeks in June with the careful, honest momentum of two people who know something is happening between them and are choosing not to rush it because it is too good to risk with haste. He met her at the store each morning when he passed on the way to the livery, and she had coffee ready because she was up before dawn and the coffee was always on, and he would lean in the doorway for 10 minutes before his work, and they would talk about whatever was in their minds, about the state of the cattle trade or the new schoolteacher who had arrived from Ohio and was discovering that the Caldwell children were a somewhat more demanding audience than she had anticipated, or about books, which was where things had gotten interesting. Nora had a shelf of books above the kitchen table that she had accumulated over years with the deliberate intent of someone who considered reading both a pleasure and a necessary act of keeping the world large when the physical geography of her life was small. She had Dickens and Cooper and a collection of natural history essays that she'd ordered from a publisher in New York and which had arrived 6 months late and been entirely worth the wait. Callum had, she discovered one morning, a copy of Moby Dick in his saddlebag, battered and water-stained and well-read, which he had bought from a bookshop in San Antonio 3 years ago. This discovery produced 15 minutes of conversation about Melville that made them both slightly late to their respective mornings, and left Nora standing in her store doorway watching him walk down the street, toward the livery with the very distinct feeling of a person who has found something unexpected and valuable in a familiar place, and is not quite sure what to do about the pleasure of it. She told her friend Ruth about him, because Ruth Haverford was the one person in Caldwell whose counsel Nora trusted without reservation. Ruth was 32 and ran the town's small infirmary with her physician husband, and she had known Nora since they were children, and had never once told her she was too stubborn, largely because Ruth's own opinion was that being stubborn was not the worst quality a woman could have in a world that frequently tried to run over women. Ruth listened to Nora's careful, measured account of Callum read, with the experienced attention of someone listening for what was being said under what was being said. "You're describing a man you like very much," Ruth said when Nora had finished. "I said I find him interesting," Nora said. "You've said the word interesting 4 times in as many minutes," Ruth said. "In my experience, interesting is what you say about something when you're not ready to say the other thing." Nora looked at her hands for a moment. "It would be very impractical," she said. "Most things worth having are," Ruth said. "He doesn't live here, Ruth. He's a trail hand. He goes where the work takes him." "That's true today," Ruth said. "It needn't be true permanently." Nora shook her head, but gently, not dismissively, and Ruth watched her friend's face with the careful attention of someone watching a person work, toward a realization they are not quite ready to arrive at. The realization came, as it often does, sideways. It was a Friday evening in the middle of July, and Caldwell was doing what Caldwell did on Friday evenings, which was to say that the saloons were loud, and the streets had an electric, slightly chaotic energy that was partly celebration, and partly the restless energy of men who had worked hard all week and needed somewhere to put it. There was music coming from the Silver Creek Saloon, and the smell of tobacco smoke and horses was heavier than usual, and the main street had the particular crowded, rumbling quality of a cattle town at the end of a week. Nora was closing up the store, pulling the shutters, moving through her end-of-day routine with the automatic precision of someone who has done it so many times it has become a kind of meditation, and Callum came by as he sometimes did on his way from the livery to wherever he was going next. Except this evening he stopped and said, "Would you walk with me?" Nora looked up from the shutter latch. "Where?" "Nowhere in particular," Callum said. "Just away from the noise for a bit." She said yes, which was not a surprising decision, and they walked south from the main street, away from the saloons and the crowd, along the edge of the town toward the open ground where the prairie began, and the stars came in unimpeded by lamplight. The evening was still warm with the remnant heat of the day, and the grass moved faintly, and the sounds of Caldwell faded to a distant rumble, and above them the sky was immense and brilliant. They walked without talking for a while, which was one of the things Nora had come to appreciate about him. That silence between them was not something that needed to be filled or explained. It was just comfortable, the way silence is comfortable between people who are at ease with each other. It was Callum who spoke first, and he spoke slowly as though testing the weight of the words before he put them down. "I've been thinking," he said, "that I don't particularly want to leave Caldwell." Nora looked at the horizon. "Where would you go?" she said. "Could go back to Texas, could follow the drives north through the fall." He paused. "But I've been happier here these past weeks than I've been anywhere in a while, and I think I owe it to myself to be honest about why." Nora said nothing, but she was very still and very attentive, which he had come to recognize as the way she listened when something mattered. "I think you know I've developed a considerable regard for you," Callum said, with the careful directness of a man who has decided that the honest way is the only way that matters. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I also thought you deserved an honest account of where I stand." Nora was quiet for a long moment, and the prairie wind moved her hair, and she was looking at the stars the way she sometimes looked at numbers in her ledger, as though she was working out something careful and important. "I'm not uncomfortable," she said finally, and the words came slowly, not from uncertainty but from precision, from wanting to say what was actually true rather than what was easy. "I think," she said, "that I have also been considerably affected by your company." Callum turned to look at her and she turned to look at him, and they were two people in the dark at the edge of a prairie town in 1879 being very honest with each other, which was rarer and more valuable than almost anything the Wild West had on offer. "I'm not good at this," Nora said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite vulnerability but was adjacent to it, something she was allowing him to hear. "I've been told often enough that I'm too difficult, too set, too unwilling to do things the expected way." "I know," Callum said. I've heard it from a few people around town." He paused. "I don't think they're describing a problem." Nora looked at him. "What do you think they're describing?" "A woman who knows who she is," Callum said. "I've been looking for that. I didn't know I was looking for it until I found it." Nora was very quiet. "I think the town called you too stubborn to love," Callum said, "and I think they were wrong. I think that's exactly what I needed." The words settled between them like something finally put in the right place, and Nora Callahan, who did not cry at sentimental moments and had not cried at Harold Prout's departure or at her father's funeral until she was alone in the store after dark, felt the back of her throat tighten in a way she refused to be embarrassed about. "You're going to make this extremely complicated for me," she said. "I'm sorry," Callum said, and he was smiling. She could hear it. "No, you're not," she said. "No," he agreed, "I'm not." And when she reached out in the darkness and found his hand, he held it with the steady, gentle certainty of a man who had been waiting to hold it and was not going to let go carelessly. They stood there for a while, at the edge of the prairie, at the edge of something new, while Caldwell made its Friday night sounds behind them and the stars burned overhead, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed to be said just then. What followed those weeks was the kind of courtship that Caldwell found simultaneously gratifying and frustrating to observe, because it was clearly happening, but it refused to be dramatic in the ways they were accustomed to. Callum did not make sweeping romantic declarations in public or arrive with flowers, or do anything that would have given the town's gossip network a clean, satisfying story to tell. He was simply there, consistently and honestly in Nora's life, working during the day and appearing in the evenings, taking her to supper at the hotel on Saturdays, walking with her to church on Sundays where they sat together without ceremony, and Millicent Graves processed this information with an expression of intense and conflicted emotion. He was learning Caldwell and it was learning him, and the process was going reasonably well on both sides. He had a particular quality of remembering things about people, not in a calculating way, but in the genuine way of someone who listened when people talked and retained what mattered to them, and this made him well liked by people who were accustomed to being paid the casual half-attention of a busy town. He remembered that old Samuel Perkins was hard of hearing on his left side and spoke accordingly. He remembered that the baker's son had a birthday coming and stopped by with a small carved wooden horse. He'd made one evening, because he had good hands and carving, was a quiet occupation suited to evenings. He helped without fanfare when help was needed, and did not make a spectacle of the helping. The men at the livery began to ask his opinion on horses, which was the professional equivalent of a very high compliment. Ezra Webb, for his part, had extended his own stay in Caldwell out of loyalty and mild curiosity, and had taken a room at the boarding house, and was spending his time very contentedly doing very little and writing letters to his wife in Abilene. He told Callum one evening that he thought this was working out nicely and that his wife had sent her regards. "You told Mrs. Webb about this," Callum said. "Martha likes to know what's happening," Ezra said, with the serenity of a man who has been married for 23 years and has made complete peace with the fact that his wife is better informed about most things than he is. In August, the Wichita supplier situation resolved itself cleanly, because Nora had written carefully and negotiated firmly and arrived at terms she was satisfied with. And when she showed Callum the correspondence, he read it carefully and then looked up and said, "That's good work," with genuine and uncomplicated admiration that hit her square in the chest. Tom Garrett came to the store in September and attempted one more round of leveraged persuasion about the benefits of dealing through him and the inadvisability of a woman doing business without proper guidance. And Nora told him with perfect composure that she had secured alternative supply arrangements and wished him success with his other accounts. And Tom Garrett left the store without what he'd come for, and Nora stood behind her counter feeling, briefly and intensely, a specific kind of satisfaction that she thought was worth all the rest of it. She told Callum that evening, and he raised the cup of coffee she'd put in front of him in a gesture of salute. "To good business," he said. "To good business," she agreed. It was in September also that things in Caldwell became briefly and genuinely complicated, due to a situation involving a pair of cattle rustlers who had been working the area through the summer and had, in the casual and destructive way of men who make a habit of taking what isn't theirs, made the mistake of trying to add the livery's horses to their enterprise on a Thursday night. Callum was sleeping in the livery because he'd been there late finishing a repair, and it had been late enough that going back to the boarding house had seemed unnecessary. He woke to the sounds of horses being disturbed, and was on his feet with his boots in his hand before the thought had finished forming. The details of what happened next were, as violent events tend to be, confused in the telling and probably somewhat exaggerated in the retelling that circulated through Caldwell over the following days. What was clear was that 2 men had been caught in the livery, and that Callum had prevented the theft, and that the sheriff had arrived to find the situation more or less under control, and that Callum had a bruise along his jaw that was 3 colors by morning, and a cut on his forearm that he seemed inclined to regard as minor, and everyone else found alarming. Nora found out through the rapid and efficient telegraph of small-town communication at 6 o'clock in the morning, and arrived at the livery before it was even fully light with a cloth and a basin, and the particular expression of a woman who is furious at a situation, and is preventing that fury from being audible, which is one of the more frightening expressions a person can wear. She cleaned the cut on his arm with a thoroughness and a gentleness that existed simultaneously and made Callum sit very still. "This needs to be cleaned properly," she said, not looking at his face, focused on what she was doing. "It's fine," he said. "It's deeper than you think," she said, and her voice was steady and even and her hands were completely steady and only the line of her jaw gave anything away. "I've had worse," Callum said. "That is not a reassuring thing to say," Nora said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm all right," he said more gently. Nora tied off the bandage and sat back and looked at him, and for a moment her composure was very slightly less than complete, something behind her eyes that was relief and something else, something more urgent and less comfortable. "I know you are," she said quietly. "Nora," he said. "Don't," she said, but not harshly, more like a word to give herself a moment. She looked at his face, at the bruise along his jaw, at the calm, steady way he was looking back at her, and she thought that she had spent 3 years being extremely sensible about the question of her own heart, and she was not entirely sure she had the energy to keep being sensible about this particular thing. "I'm very glad you're all right," she said, and it came out quieter and more direct and more freighted with meaning than she'd intended, and she watched Callum's expression receive it and understood that it had landed exactly the way it was meant to. "I know," he said again, more softly. She stood up and collected the basin and the cloth with her usual efficient movements. "Come to the store for breakfast," she said from the doorway without turning around. "You need to eat something." "Yes, ma'am," Callum said, with a warmth in it that made her walk out quickly before she could have any more feelings in front of him. She made him a large breakfast and they sat at the kitchen table in the early morning light and ate without talking much, and the silence between them was full of something that had shifted the night before, and neither of them was quite ready to put words to yet. And it was enough, in that particular moment, to just be in the same room eating eggs and biscuits while the September sun came through the east window and made the kitchen warm. It was the end of September when Callum asked her, with the same straightforward directness he applied to most things, if she would consider letting him stay in Caldwell permanently. They were in the store, after hours, and the lamplight was golden and the street outside was quiet, and he was helping her move a new delivery of flour sacks because the delivery boy had been down with a cold, and the flour had been sitting in the back since morning. He set down a sack and said without preamble, "I've been thinking about what I want to do, long term." Nora set down her own sack and waited. Ezra is heading back to Abilene next week, Callum said. He's been away from Martha long enough and they both know it. He's been very patient, Nora said. He has. Callum paused, and there was the quality she recognized, the careful deliberateness of a man who wants to say something precisely right. There's a property outside town that Henderson is selling. 10 acres, a house that needs work, a barn that's solid. I've got what I made from the horses. It would be a start. Nora was very still. I'm not asking you anything tonight, Callum said clearly. I want to be plain about that. I know you run this store and it's yours and you've built it and it matters to you. I'm not asking you to change anything. I'm telling you that I want to be here, in this town near you, and build something here, and that whatever comes next is whatever you decide comes next. Nora looked at him for a long moment, and he met her gaze with that steady, patient quality that had undone her so gradually she almost hadn't noticed it happening. What if I'm still too stubborn? She said, and there was something in it that was not quite a joke and not quite a question but was both. Then I'll still be here, Callum said. That's not a threat, that's just where I'd like to be. Nora Callahan, who had run her father's store for 4 years and managed her own life with brisk independence, and had been told by most of the town that she was too difficult to love, stood in the lamplight of her own store and felt the last of her careful reserve give way like ice in spring. Not dramatically, not with a collapse, but with the quiet, inevitable loosening of something that had been held too long and could finally be put down. Henderson's property has a good south-facing hill, she said. Horses would winter well there. Callum's expression shifted, and it was one of the finest things she had ever seen, that shift, the quiet opening of a face that had been waiting for something. It does, he said. You'd need a good well, she said. There's already one, he said. The house needs a new kitchen, she said. I know how to build a kitchen, Callum said, and there was a smile in it now, and she let herself smile back, and it was real and wide and entirely without caution. I know you do, she said. He crossed the space between them with the deliberate, unhurried quality that was entirely his, and he cupped her face in his calloused hands as though she was something worth being careful with. And when he kissed her, it was warm and earnest and thorough, and it tasted like coming home to a place she hadn't known she was looking for. When they broke apart, she kept her hands where they'd settled against his chest and looked up at him in the lamplight, and he looked back at her with his warm brown eyes that were unhurried and unguarded and entirely present. The town thinks I'm too stubborn to love, she said. The town is wrong, Callum said. I told you that. You did, she said. Are you going to argue with me about it? Probably at some point, she said. I'm stubborn. Good, Callum said, and he meant it completely, and she knew that he did, and she thought that was perhaps the most remarkable thing about him, that he meant it completely. Ezra Webb departed the following week for Abilene, and his farewell was conducted with considerable dignity at the edge of town where the southbound road began. He shook Callum's hand for a long time and then nodded at Nora with the solemn approval of a man conferring a blessing he'd been holding in trust. Write to me, Ezra told Callum. You hate letters, Callum said. Martha likes getting them, Ezra said, and climbed onto his horse and rode away without looking back, which was the kind of dignified exit that Ezra Webb managed naturally, because he had the good sense to know when a moment should be left clean. Callum bought Henderson's property in October, and the Caldwell community, which had been watching all of this with the concentrated interest of a town that takes its role as witness to all significant events very seriously, processed this information and arrived at a collective revised opinion. It was still not entirely without reservation, because Caldwell's reservations about Nora Callahan ran deep and were not entirely dissolved by one cowboy purchasing a piece of land, but the general sense was moving decidedly toward something it could recognize and approve of, which was a man settling down and building something. The house did need substantial work, and Callum approached it with the same methodical competence he brought to everything, making a list and working through it in order, doing the structural things first, the foundation and the framing, and then the roof, which he fixed with the same care he'd given Nora's storehouse roof that first week, working in the October light with the leaves turning on the cottonwoods along the creek. Nora came out on Sundays and brought food and worked alongside him on the interior things, the plaster and the painting, the shelves for the kitchen, and those Sundays had a quality that she would remember for the rest of her life. The two of them in the half-finished house in the autumn light, talking and working and sometimes not talking, the simple, profound comfort of building something together. Ruth Haverford came to visit the property one Sunday afternoon and stood in the kitchen that was beginning to take shape and looked at Nora with the expression of a woman who knows she is not going to have to say, "I told you so," because the evidence is sufficiently eloquent on its own. "He built these shelves," Nora said, running a hand along a length of smooth, level pine. "They're good shelves," Ruth said. "They are," Nora agreed, and the way she said it meant everything the words didn't say. Ruth hugged her before she left, which was not something Ruth did often and therefore meant something specific, and Nora held on for a moment and then let go and went back to the kitchen and found Callum standing in the doorway with his sleeves rolled up and a smear of paint on his forearm and looking at her with the quiet happiness of a man who is exactly where he wants to be. "Well," he said. "She approves," Nora said. "Good," Callum said. "I was hoping." It was November, on a Saturday that was cold and clear, with the first real bite of winter in the air and frost on the grass in the mornings, that Callum asked her to marry him. He did not do it dramatically, which was consistent with who he was. He did not get down on one knee in the middle of the main street or announce it in the hotel dining room. He asked her one evening at her kitchen table above the store, where they had been having dinner for months, where the first real conversation between them had taken place, where the lamplight was warm and familiar, and the smell of coffee was always present. He put a ring on the table between them, a simple gold ring that he had ordered through the store 3 weeks previous in a transaction that Nora had somehow failed to notice, which she later said was the most extraordinary feat of logistics he had managed, because she noticed everything in that store. "I'd like to marry you," he said, "if you'll have me." Nora looked at the ring and then at him, and she thought about all the ways she had been told she was too difficult, and all the years she had run this store alone, and all the empty evenings before he'd walked through her door needing coffee and salt pork. And she thought about the shingle repair and the venison dinner and the prairie dark with his hand warm around hers. And she thought about Sunday mornings in the half-finished house, and the way he looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking for a long time. "Yes," she said, clearly and without hesitation, and picked up the ring and put it on her own finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her, which it had, because Callum had borrowed one of her other rings to get the measurement. He had planned ahead. He always had. She stood up and came around the table and sat beside him on the bench rather than across from him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder, and they sat like that for a long time in the warm kitchen while the November wind moved around the building outside and the lamp burned steady. "The town is going to have a lot to say about this," Nora said. "Let them," Callum said. "You might regret that position," she said. "I doubt it," he said. She tilted her head up to look at him. "You're very sure of yourself sometimes." "I'm very sure of you," he said, and that was different, and she understood the difference, and she kissed him briefly and warmly and settled back against his shoulder. "Millicent Graves is going to organize a social function," Nora said. "She won't be able to help herself." "I can endure a social function," Callum said. "It'll be long," Nora warned. "I'll survive," he said. She was right about Millicent Graves. The social function was announced within 48 hours of the engagement becoming known, which happened extremely quickly because Caldwell was a town where keeping a secret required either extraordinary effort or the active non-cooperation of most of the population. And Nora's ring had been noted by 3 separate people before she'd finished opening the store the morning after he'd given it to her. The engagement social was held at the Graves house and was attended by what felt like everyone in Caldwell, and a good portion of the surrounding farms. And Millicent Graves did a very impressive job of taking credit for the whole thing through the strategic deployment of language that implied she had always had a good feeling about Nora's prospects, and had in some way been supportive of the entire situation. Callum stood next to Nora through the long evening of it, and shook a great many hands, and answered the same questions a considerable number of times with the patient good humor of a man who understands that this is the price of becoming part of a community and is willing to pay it. He was unfailingly polite and warm without being effusive, and by the end of the evening he had made a favorable impression on enough people that even the most skeptical members of Caldwell's social hierarchy were grudgingly conceding that Nora Callahan had done all right for herself. "You were very good tonight," Nora said, when they were finally walking home in the cold November air. "It was fine," Callum said. "You answered the question about your parents' ranch in Texas at least 8 separate times," she said. "9, he said. "But George Henley asked it twice at different points in the evening, so perhaps he's the only one who really needed to know." She laughed, and her breath made a white cloud in the cold air, and he caught her hand in his and held it as they walked, and the bare trees along the street rattled their branches in the wind, and Caldwell was quiet and cold and theirs in the way that places become yours when you've decided to belong to them. They were married on a Saturday in December, in the Caldwell church, which was decorated with pine boughs because Ruth Haverford had organized this without being asked, because Ruth understood what a wedding should look like even when the principals were somewhat indifferent to decoration. It was a ceremony of precise and deliberate words, spoken without fidgeting or hesitation by both of them, because they were both people who, when they committed to something, committed completely. Callum wore his best coat and had cut his hair and been barbered properly, and Nora wore a dark blue wool dress that she had made herself over the previous 3 weeks with the help of Ruth and a borrowed sewing machine, and she had her copper hair pinned with a care she did not usually bother with, and she walked down the center of the church with her chin level and her eyes bright, and Callum watched her come toward him with an expression of such open and uncomplicated love that even Tom Garrett, who had come to the wedding out of some combination of social obligation and curiosity, felt a small and uncomfortable stab of something like conscience. "I do," Nora said, with the same decisive clarity that she brought to good business decisions and the refusal of bad ones. "I do," Callum said, with the warm steadiness of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean. The minister beamed. Ruth cried quietly and pretended she hadn't. Ezra Webb was not there because he was in Abilene, but a letter arrived 3 days later in which he and Martha offered their warmest congratulations, and Martha enclosed a recipe for apple cake that she said was appropriate for newlyweds, and which they made the following Sunday morning in their kitchen in the house outside town, where the south-facing hill caught the December light, and the new shelves held Nora's books next to Callum's battered copy of Moby Dick. They moved into the house together in January of 1880, and Nora kept the store because it was hers, and she was not going to give it up, and Callum found work as a horse trader operating out of Caldwell, which suited his skills and his knowledge, and allowed him to be home consistently rather than trailing for months at a time. And this arrangement suited them both precisely, because neither of them had been asked to be anything other than what they were. The first winter in the house was cold in the way that Kansas winters are cold, which is to say thoroughly and without apology, and they spent those evenings by the fire with books and conversation, and the particular happiness of 2 people who have chosen well and know it. They disagreed sometimes, because they were both people with opinions and convictions, and these disagreements were direct and honest and resolved without either of them pretending they didn't exist, and they were better after each one for having had it. Callum found, that winter, that he had never been so well rested in his adult life, not because life was easy, because it wasn't, but because he was no longer carrying the low-grade restlessness of a person searching for where they were supposed to be. Nora found, that winter, that she had been lonely for much longer than she had been willing to admit, and that the loneliness was so thoroughly resolved by his presence that she sometimes had to stop what she was doing and just look at him across the room and feel the uncomplicated gratitude of it. By March, the store was doing well, and the new Wichita supply contract was proving worth every bit of negotiation she'd put into it. And the horses that Callum had been sourcing from a contact in West Texas and selling to the ranchers around Caldwell were building a modest but solid reputation. He was known for honest dealing and good horseflesh, and the kind of straightforward transaction that did not require anyone to check their pockets afterward. Ruth Haverford visited often, and the friendship between the two women deepened in the way that friendships deepen when they are allowed the space and the honesty they require. Ruth liked Callum because he was good to her friend and did not make her friend smaller, and she told him this directly one afternoon when they happened to be at the store at the same time and Nora was in the back dealing with a delivery. "You're good for her," Ruth said, with the directness of a woman who has delivered babies and treated injuries and has therefore moved well past the point of social circumlocution. "She's good for me," Callum said with equal directness. "Yes," Ruth said. "But men don't often know that about stubborn women until it's too late. You knew from the start." "I knew when she went up on the roof to check my work," Callum said, and Ruth looked at him and then laughed outright, because it was so perfectly exactly Nora that it was irresistible. Spring came to Caldwell with the sudden extravagance that Kansas springs tend to arrive with, after the tight gray grip of winter, the land greening almost overnight, and the sky moving to that particular shade of blue that seems impossibly deep after months of white and brown. The 10 acres around the house came alive with it, and Callum planted a kitchen garden with a focused attention to detail that Nora found extremely attractive in a way she was willing to acknowledge openly by this point. "You know," she told him, watching him work one April morning from the kitchen doorway with her coffee in both hands, "you take that garden very seriously. You take your inventory very seriously," Callum said, without looking up from the furrow he was making. "That's different," she said. "That's commerce. Eating regularly is also commerce," he said, "just a different form." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was not quite disagreement and went back inside to get his coffee. In May of 1880, Nora told him she was expecting a child, and she told him the way she did most significant things, directly and without ceremony, at the kitchen table over supper, watching his face with the careful attention of someone who has learned to read that face and values what it tells her. Callum put down his fork and looked at her, and the expression that moved across his face was so thoroughly and openly happy that she felt it land in her chest like something warm and solid. "Are you sure?" he said. "I'm very sure," she said. Ruth confirmed it. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it and was very quiet for a moment, not because he had nothing to say but because he was someone who felt large things quietly, and she had learned to recognize the quality of this silence as distinct from other silences. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm perfectly fine," she said. "A little tired. Ruth says that's normal." "Then we'll make sure you have the time to rest," he said. "I'm not going to stop running the store, Callum," she said. "I know," he said, and she recognized the difference between those words and an argument and loved him for it. He squeezed her hand once, warm and certain, and then picked up his fork and they continued with supper, because that was who they were, and the conversation that followed was about the garden and the horses and the expanding supply network. But beneath all of it, in the easy quiet between them, the warmth of the news they just exchanged continued to glow. It was a boy, born in December of 1880, in the bedroom of the house on the south-facing hill, with Ruth Haverford present and entirely competent and Callum in the kitchen keeping the fire and the water going, and trying very hard to maintain his composure, which he found considerably more difficult than he'd anticipated. The boy was healthy and loud, and arrived in the world with a directness that Ruth said was very familiar. They named him William, for Nora's father, and called him Will within the first week because the house was too small for 3 full syllables at 2 in the morning. Callum held his son for the first time with the careful, absolute focus of a man handling something of great and irreplaceable value, and Nora watched him from the bed, tired and satisfied and enormously fond of everything she was seeing, and thought that there was no version of this that she had ever allowed herself to imagine, and that the actual thing was better than imagining would have permitted anyway. "Hello," Callum said very quietly to the baby, who was looking up at him with the unfocused intensity of the newly born. "I'm your father. You're going to have an interesting life." Will made a sound that communicated his general position on the subject, which was that life was already more than adequately eventful. "Thank you very much." "He's stubborn already," Nora said from the pillow. "Good," Callum said, without looking up from the baby's face. "That's exactly what I needed." Nora closed her eyes and smiled, and felt something settle in her so completely, and so deeply, that it seemed to reach all the way to the floor and hold there. Will grew, as babies do, with remarkable swiftness, and 1881 brought with it the particular texture of a life that was full in every direction, the store and the horses and the house and the child and each other, and it was busy and sometimes difficult and always worth it. Callum expanded his horse trading to include a partnership with a rancher 15 miles south of Caldwell, who had excellent stock and an interest in a reliable buyer network. And this gave the business a steadier foundation. And the money was not extravagant, but it was good and consistent and honest. Nora hired a girl named Clara, 17 years old and sensible, to help in the store 3 days a week, which allowed Nora the time she needed and kept the store running at the standard she required, which was high but clear, and Clara, who was sensible, adapted to it quickly and found she enjoyed working for someone whose expectations were explicit rather than implied. Ruth's husband expanded the infirmary that year, adding a second room for patients who needed more than a single visit's treatment. And Caldwell was growing in the way that frontier towns either grow or collapse, and this one had decided to grow, and it was doing so with the combined energy of people who had chosen to stay and build something. Old Widow Perkins, whom Nora had nursed through a fever 2 winters back, died peacefully in January of 1881, and the town mourned her in the proper way, and Nora went to the funeral and stood in the cold churchyard with Will wrapped against her chest and Callum's hand warm at her back, and felt the weight of the community she was part of, with all its imperfections and its irritations and its essential, irreplaceable value. Millicent Graves, to her credit, had moved her opinion of Nora significantly over the past year and a half, partly because Callum's general impressiveness had reflected well on Nora's judgment in a way that could not be entirely ignored, and partly because Millicent was not, beneath the social performance, an unkind woman, and she had simply required the evidence of Nora's happiness to revise what she'd been certain of. She stopped Nora outside the church one Sunday in the spring of 1881 and said, with the particular quality of a woman making an admission that costs her something, "I was wrong about you, Nora, or wrong about what you needed. I think you've done very well." Nora looked at her and found that she could receive this without irony because it was genuine, and genuine things deserve to be received genuinely. "Thank you, Millicent," she said, and meant it. In the summer of 1881, Ezra Webb came to visit, which had been planned for some time through correspondence, and brought his wife Martha, who was a compact, energetic woman with very bright eyes and an immediately clear devotion to Ezra that coexisted with an equally clear comprehensive assessment of his faults, and who took to Nora within approximately 15 minutes of meeting her. "You're exactly as I imagined," Martha told Nora over supper the first evening. "Is that a good thing?" Nora said. "Very," Martha said. "I imagined someone who wouldn't put up with any nonsense, and here you are." Ezra and Callum spent the week in the easy company of men who are glad of each other's continued existence, and Martha and Nora found in each other a wavelength of directness and practicality that produced conversations of considerable depth and entertainment. And by the end of the week, the two couples had established the kind of friendship that has a geography and does not require proximity to remain real. On the last evening after supper, when Ezra and Callum had gone to sit outside and the kitchen was warm with the remnants of the meal and Will was asleep in his room down the hall, Martha told Nora that Ezra had come home from that first summer in Caldwell and told her there was a woman who ran a store there who had green eyes and no patience for nonsense, and that Callum had fixed her roof and was thinking about staying. He said Callum had that look, Martha said. What look? Nora said. Like a man who'd found North, Martha said. Nora was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. And did he find it? Look at him, Martha said, nodding toward the window where Callum and Ezra were visible in the evening light. Callum with his easy posture and the quiet certainty that was so essentially his. What do you think? Nora thought of everything that had happened since a Tuesday in June of 1879. A man coming through her door needing coffee and noticing her roof leak, and all the evenings since, and the ring at the kitchen table, and the church with Ruth crying and the pine boughs and Will's voice in the morning, and Callum's hands and his patience, and the way he looked at her like she was exactly enough of everything. I think he found North, Nora said. So did you, Martha said, and this was true, and Nora held it warmly and did not argue with it. The years that followed were good ones. They were not without their difficulties, because life on the Kansas frontier in the early 1880s was not without its difficulties, and there were dry summers and hard winters and the occasional bad business quarter, and the ordinary accumulations of grief and adjustment that are part of any life lived fully. But the difficulties were met with the combined resources of two people who complemented each other in the precise and useful way of two things built to work together: her precision and his patience, her directness and his steadiness, her knowledge of commerce and community, and his knowledge of land and animals and the long view. The 10 acres flourished. Callum expanded the horse trading into a recognized operation, and by 1883, he had a partnership arrangement with 2 other ranchers in the area and was supplying horses to buyers as far north as Abilene. Nora expanded the store, knocking through to the adjacent empty property that came available in 1882, and adding a dry goods section that had been previously absent from Caldwell's commercial landscape and was found to be extremely useful. They had a second child in 1883, a girl they named Frances Alina, called Franny before she was a week old, who arrived with the same decisive directness as her brother, but with an additional quality of absolute certainty about her own preferences that Callum said was an extremely familiar characteristic. She's going to be exactly like you, he told Nora on the second day, looking down at Franny's small, fierce face. Is that a complaint? Nora said. It's the best thing I can imagine, he said, and he meant it completely. Will, who was 2 years old at the time of his sister's arrival, regarded her for a long, assessing moment when he was first brought to see her, with the concentrated evaluation of a very small person absorbing significant information, and then announced that she was small but all right, which was deemed a positive first assessment. Ruth Haverford, who had been present at the arrival of both children, and was by this point something so close to family that the distinction hardly required mentioning, held Franny in the golden autumn light of the bedroom window, and looked at Nora with an expression of such pure, uncomplicated joy that it made the moment perfect. You've built something remarkable, Ruth said, and she was talking about more than the children, and Nora knew it, and felt the truth of it reach all the way down to the foundation. Callum was in the doorway, Will on his hip, watching his wife and his new daughter and Ruth in the warm light, and he had the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere completely and knows it, and who will not take the arrival lightly. In the spring of 1884, Ezra Webb passed away quietly in Abilene, and Martha wrote with the news in a letter that Nora read aloud to Callum at the kitchen table, and they were both quiet for a long time afterward, and Callum went outside and stood in the April wind for a while, and Nora let him have that. And later she brought him coffee on the porch and sat beside him and didn't say anything, just sat, because that was sometimes the right and complete thing to do. They made the journey to Abilene for the funeral, which was the first time they had left Caldwell together since their marriage, and Martha met them at the door of her house with the composed, dignified grief of a woman who had loved her husband for 26 years and was not going to perform her loss for anyone, but was also not going to pretend it wasn't enormous. Callum held Martha's hands for a long time and said, "He was the finest man I knew," and Martha nodded and said, "He was proud of you," and Callum's jaw was very tight for a moment and Nora's hand was at his back. They stayed in Abilene for 4 days, and Nora was grateful, in a way she had not anticipated being grateful, for the chance to know Martha more fully in this different context, to see the life she and Ezra had built together in the house and the community, and the small particular evidence of a long shared life. And she thought about what she and Callum were building and felt the importance of it in a new and deepened way. On the journey home, on the second day of riding through the flat Kansas spring, Callum said, out of a comfortable silence, "Ezra always said the point of doing hard things was so that the good things were worth arriving at." "He was right," Nora said. "He usually was," Callum said, "except about beans." Nora looked at him sidelong. What was wrong with his beans? "He cooked them too long," Callum said, with the conviction of a man who has strong feelings about properly cooked beans, and Nora laughed, and the laugh carried out across the open Kansas spring and settled back into the comfortable warmth between them. Martha Webb came to visit Caldwell the following summer, and the summer after that, and eventually these visits became a fixture of the calendar. Martha arriving each July with more food than 2 people could eat and opinions on everything, and a warmth that filled whatever room she was in. And the children adored her in the uncomplicated way that children adore people who treat them as complete and interesting persons rather than small obligations. By 1885, Will was 5 years old and had his father's steadiness and his mother's directness. And Franny was 2, and had the particular combination of stubbornness and charm that made her universally adored and occasionally extremely challenging. And the house on the south-facing hill was full in all the ways that a house can be full, with noise and love and the productive business of a life being actively lived. Nora stood in the store one morning in the spring of 1885, watching Clara, who was now 21 and had become an excellent manager of the store's daily operations, handling a complex order from a new customer with the confident competence of someone who had learned well. And she felt a satisfaction that was layered and whole, made up of all the years of work and the fair dealing, and the refused compromises, and the stubbornness that everyone had called a problem and that had, it turned out, been a foundation. Callum came by the store at mid-morning, the way he sometimes still did, and leaned in the doorway, and she looked at him across the store with the same measuring gaze she'd used the first day, except that now it was full of everything that had come after, and he looked back at her with his warm brown eyes and the ease of a man who has put down whatever was heavy and has not needed to pick it back up. "Come for lunch," he said. "I've got an inventory," she said. "Clara can do it," he said. "Clara has other things this afternoon," she said. "Nora," he said. "Callum," she said. They looked at each other across the store with the easy familiarity of people who know exactly how this particular exchange ends, which is with both of them in the kitchen of the house on the south-facing hill eating lunch in the midday light while the horses moved in the paddock and the children were at Ruth's for the morning. "Fine," she said. "Give me 20 minutes." He waited on the front step of the store and passed the time in the comfortable, unhurried way that was entirely his, watching Caldwell go about its business, the wagon traffic on the main street, the sign outside the hotel that needed repainting, the new family that had arrived last month from Missouri and were still working out where they fit, the way the spring light made even the rough edges of a frontier town look like something with a future. Nora came out at the 20-minute mark exactly because she was Nora, and she pulled the door closed behind her and looked at him on the step, and he stood up and there was a moment. One of those moments that is made of everything before it and is therefore made of a great deal, where they were just looking at each other in the spring morning on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas. "Ready?" he said. "Ready," she said, and took his arm, and they walked together along the street toward home. Caldwell watched them go, the way small towns always watch their people, with the interested and proprietary affection of a community that has made up its mind. And what it said now, in the particular comfortable murmur of a town that has revised its opinion, and is not ashamed to say so, was that Nora Callahan Reed was one of theirs, and that Cowboy she'd married was one of theirs too, and that it had all worked out about as well as anything in this part of Kansas had ever worked out. Which was very well indeed. The house on the south-facing hill stood solid and warm against the Kansas sky, with its kitchen garden and its good barn and its well that had never run dry, and the books on the shelves mixed together now, hers and his, the natural history essays and the Dickens and the Warren Melville, and several new volumes that had come through the store and been set aside because one or the other of them had thought the other would want to read it. The two children grew in the house with the particular wildness and warmth of children who are loved by parents who love each other, who are raised by people with convictions and kindness in equal measure, who learn early that stubbornness and steadiness are not weaknesses, but the architecture of a life that holds. Callum Reed, 36 years old in 1885, sitting on the porch of his own house in the evening light with a cup of coffee and his wife's shoulder against his arm, and the sound of their children's voices from inside the house, thought about the 20 years of trailing and traveling, and the restless searching quality of a life that had not yet arrived, and thought about a Tuesday in June of 1879, when he pushed open a door for coffee beans, and found green eyes measuring him from behind a counter. The best thing that had ever happened to him had started with a roof leak. He thought Ezra would have appreciated that detail. Nora, for her part, sat on the porch in the evening and felt the spring air on her face and heard her children and felt her husband's warmth beside her and thought about all the years she had run this life with brisk competence and good sense, and had been lonely without fully naming it, and thought about how the loneliness had resolved so completely that its absence was now simply the texture of her days. She was still stubborn. She was under no illusions about this. She still had opinions and held them firmly, still ran her store with exacting standards, still refused to do things the expected way when the expected way was wrong. But she had learned gradually and honestly that being known completely and loved anyway was not the threat to her independence she had feared it might be. It was, in fact, its own kind of freedom. The town had called her too stubborn to love. The cowboy had said that was exactly what he needed. They had both been right in their way. The town had been right that she was stubborn. The cowboy had been right that it was exactly what he needed. And it had turned out, in the way that the best things do, that what he needed was also exactly what she needed, and that neither of them had known this until it was standing in front of them in the particular, unrepeatable form of each other. The evening settled over Caldwell and the prairie rolled outward in every direction under the enormous Kansas sky, and the stars came up one by one as they always had and always would. And in the house on the south-facing hill, the lamps were lit, and the kitchen was warm, and the children were being coaxed toward bed by a man who was patient enough to do this without making it a battle, and by a woman who was direct enough to do this without making it a negotiation. And together they were more than adequate to the task and to all the tasks before and after it. It was a good life. It was a real life. It was theirs, and that entirely was enough.